This is the Water Table.
A chance to hear the agricultural side of these issues.
A place for people to go find information and education.
Water management is just going to become even more critical into the future.
How misunderstood what we do is.
I would encourage people to open their minds and listen to this dialogue.
Welcome to the Water Table Podcast. Today's episode, we will be discussing the case for water management. With us today, we have a really exciting guest. Matt Helmers is the director of Iowa Nutrient Research Center, the dean professor in the Agricultural Life Sciences College, and a professor in the Department of Agriculture and Biosystems Engineering at Iowa State University, where he has been on the faculty since 2003. Dr. Helmer's research areas include studies on the impact of nutrient management, cropping practices, drainage design and management, and strategic placement of buffer systems on nutrient export from agricultural landscapes. He has a regional extension program working to increase adoption of practices that have the potential to introduce downstream nutrient export. Dr. Helmers, thanks for joining us. We're excited to spend some time together and talk about drainage.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jamie. Thanks a lot for that introduction. I'm not sure that I'm the most exciting person, but boy, I'm always excited to talk about drainage. So really look forward to our chat today.
Yeah, great. So let's start. Just tell us a little bit more about your roles and responsibilities at Iowa State.
Yeah, so I've been at Iowa State since 2003. I'm a native Iowan from the northwest part of Iowa. One thing that I guess is maybe somewhat interesting is that my family farms up in that area. My grandfather farmed, and I spent a lot of time there when I was young. And I have a picture of myself out in the field when I was about 6 or 7 years old with my grandfather's tractor stuck, a second tractor in front of that stuck, and a third one pulling it out. As I think back about it, I learned then the importance of drainage. And so I was fortunate in 2003 to come to Iowa State, come back to Iowa, and then have been able to work in the drainage area, drainage water quality, and kind of ag water quality areas. In 2018, I was fortunate enough to be named the director of the Nutrient Research Center. So we fund a number of research projects that are looking at ag water quality issues or ag management issues and how we can balance the economics and profitability with improving our water.
I saw on social media here in the last couple of weeks a picture of yourself when you were a youngster, and then of your daughter with the same Iowa State gear on. And it must be pretty rewarding to be working back at your alma mater and just experiencing some of the things that you did from childhood as far as supporting your college. Yeah,
I feel very fortunate. When I think about that, I kind of have to pinch myself because certainly I grew up an Iowa State fan, did my undergraduate here. So, I feel so fortunate to be back here and doing something I enjoy and for a college that I have a lot of faith in and admiration for.
The area of expertise you're in, just a long history at Iowa State. My days going back 30 years, and Dr. Stuart Melvin was kind of the godfather of drainage for the Upper Midwest, and that was always our go-to. Back a senior salesman of ours back in the day was John Pogge Sr., and John would always say, well, let's call Stuart on this issue. And so it's fun now to continue this relationship between Prinsco and Iowa State and our industry. So when we're talking about managing water on the farm, what are the benefits of drainage? We're going to go into a lot of details, but we hope that on this podcast that there's some general public that are listening to this too, and they can learn a little bit about what we do on the farm.
So, if we think about our agricultural systems and the area that we work in, kind of upper Midwest, rain-fed agricultural systems. Now, if we looked at it on an annual basis, many areas we get enough rainfall to grow the crop really well. But what happens is there are times when we get too much rainfall. We get excess precipitation. And because of the types of soils we have soils where we build up a water table. And so we'll get excess water within the root zone of whatever crop we're going to, that we maybe try to grow out there. So we displace the oxygen or the air in that soil, and we have water in there, and that's going to hurt the roots. And so, one of the biggest things is that drainage allows us to have aerated soil conditions for crop production. That's one of the ways that we enhance crop production. I think that's a really important one. But you also brought up trafficability, and I think trafficability is really important as we think about the frequency of some of our events and maybe the projections for wetter springs. So, if we get a rainfall event and we have drainage in that field, we're going to be able to draw that water table down a little bit quicker. We're going to get air back in those soils. We're going to see that soil dry out a little quicker so that we can, do our field operations, and maybe most relevant is planting. And so, I think about it, if we can get in and plant that, a day or two earlier with drainage, boy, what would have happened if we would have gotten a rain a day later and we hadn't gotten it planted and we were delayed another 2 weeks from planting? That could have a big impact on that crop production. That planting date is so critical. And so that drainage helps us kind of be able to get into that field when those field conditions are consistent with planting. And I think there's to me, there's a couple reasons that's important. Like I talked about, the potential for wetter springs. But then as we see operations that are maybe limited in their window when they have to get planting, maybe it's because they have some, an off-farm job and they need to get it done at this point in time, or they have a lot of acres and so they have to get over it. So I think that's another, aspect that's so important is that planting date. Maybe one thing we don't think about, but kind of comes in that trafficability is, growing up, my grandfather got some tractors stuck. If we have drainage and we can minimize some of that, we minimize some of the wear and tear on our machinery as well. So I think that's maybe a side that isn't as thought about as often. So I think all of those are reasons why that drainage is so important from a crop production standpoint. We'll talk about the water quality aspects we need to consider and deal with, which I think we're learning more about and have practice in.
Yeah, and I just listening to you made me think about the difference between 2019 and 2020 when it comes to planting. Take drainage aside,
yeah.
We couldn't plant the crop due to such an extremely cold, wet spring throughout the major portion of the Midwest in 2019. We got planted very late, late May and early June in some cases. And then in 2020, we had a great spring, early start to the spring. They could plant early, and look at the kind of yields that came out of that, in areas where we didn't have significant drought or the wind blow down, stuff like that. In Iowa, areas where they didn't have that, you can just totally see that because of that early plant date, there was significantly better yields. And so if you put drainage in there, the people that got planted early in 19 because they got in those few days before it started raining, they had great yields too.
Yep, you're exactly right.
So yeah, appreciate that. And even when you're talking about wear and tear on equipment too, greenhouse gas emissions and use of fuel, you're just going to use a lot more when it's muddy and you're pushing through and can't get it done on the same pace you can when your field conditions are better.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that you kind of mentioned earlier that I forgot to talk about, but if we get better yields, and we put on similar inputs of nitrogen, for example, in our field, if we get better yields, we're going to get, more bushels per unit of end input. And so, as we think about some of these environmental side of things as well, that if that drainage allows us to get better yields, and we would have put on the same amount of nitrogen anyway, we may have greater potential to export that nitrogen out of the field rather than having it susceptible to loss.
For sure. Well, that's kind of goes into dovetails well for us into water quality. Let's talk a little bit about water quality. In our industry, this is often referred to as drainage water management, but we're really talking about water quality. Both you and your university have been actively studying and developing solutions at the intersection of production, agriculture, and conservation. Can you speak to kind of the cooperative success that you've seen in those areas?
Yeah, I think we have. I think people at our university, I think at the land-grant universities across the Midwest and the Agricultural Research Service have been doing so. And so I think we've looked at ways where we have this drainage system. We need to recognize that where we have this annual cropping system and we get that excess precipitation, we get nitrate moving below the plant root zone. I think it's important to recognize, though, that even if we don't have tile drainage, we still lose nitrate below the plant root zone, from those crops. So, the best example I use is the Central Platte Valley of Nebraska. There's not tile drainage there, but they lose nitrate below the plant root zone that then goes to the shallow groundwater. Where we do have tile drainage, that water is intercepted by the tile line and then taken to a downstream water body. And so we've certainly looked at, us and others have a long history of looking at, infield management of nitrogen and cover crops. But then, one of the things that's kind of happened in the last 15 to 20 years is looking at, can we intercept that tile drainage before it's delivered to the stream and use Mother Nature to a certain extent to remove that nitrate so that we deliver, lower nitrate coming to the downstream water body. So we're still, enhancing crop production in the field, but removing that nitrate that gets into the tile lines. And so things like controlled drainage, where we manage that drainage outlet, subsurface drainage bioreactors or kind of wood chip trench bioreactors, saturated buffers are another one, nitrate removal wetlands as well. And then a new one that a number of us are looking at is drainage water recycling. And I think all of those are kind of edge of field practices that we can utilize to reduce that delivery of nitrate downstream.
Okay, so we're going to talk here a little bit later on in this episode about denitrifying wetlands. I want to ask you some questions, but what do you see as the most promising drainage water management practice being used right now?
That's a great question, Jamie, and many people won't like this, but I'm going to use the university answer of it depends. But I think there's a reason it depends, because all those practices, if you have a flat field, pretty uniformly sloped flat field, 0.5%, I think controlled drainage could be a really good practice of holding back some water during certain times of the year to minimize nitrate outflow and maybe provide some water for crop production. But you need a kind of a field that's conducive for that to work. If you are next to a stream where you have nice soils next to that stream, high carbon content, where you could put in a saturated buffer, that might be your most cost-effective nitrate reduction practice, because we put a tile line along the upstream edge of maybe a buffer we have next to a stream. We promote shallow groundwater flow and get denitrification. So I think that could be effective. If we're in a situation where we have a field that we have a location where maybe this denitrification bioreactor, wood chip trench bioreactor would go, we don't have the opportunity for a saturated buffer. We don't have the flat field for controlled drainage, but maybe the bioreactor would work. And then I think that the wetlands, we kind of have to have a location where maybe we can outlet that tile line via gravity, or, people are looking at pump systems too, but we'd have to kind of have that siting location that would work best. So I think it's not necessarily a one size fits all. It's really thinking about that field, that drainage system, and what might work best to treat that water before it moves downstream. So I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, I think you did.
I kind of punted, but hopefully that gives people a little bit of an idea on my thinking.
But, what are the biggest challenges in achieving widespread adoption. And I think you've kind of said that it just depends on the different, how the field lays, what the opportunities are on each piece of property. But, anything to add there? And then, what are the biggest opportunities in front of us, too, when it comes to that with water quality and these practices?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think there are a couple reasons, a couple things. One is definitely that, each site is a little bit different. But I think, we do have to recognize all these practices we've talked about cost somebody money to put in. And so if we think about, controlled drainage, saturated buffers, bioreactors, and wetlands, there's some cost there, and there's not at least a direct economic return, at least in the short term. And so, I think we have to understand that, and think through how do we scale this up when we think about the financial resources that might be needed. We haven't talked much about, but one of the emerging practices that we're starting to look at that I think could balance this a little bit, or at least has the potential, is this drainage water recycling, where we capture that drainage water that would have otherwise gone downstream. We store it in some on-farm storage, and then we use that for supplemental irrigation to try to enhance crop production in the field. And so by doing so, we would reduce downstream delivery of those nutrients and recycle the nutrients and the water back within the crop. It definitely has the potential to improve crop yield, even in the upper Midwest rain-fed area. The question is how much, and that's where I think we need some, and we are doing some, but we need more research to document that and look at the cost effectiveness of that type of system, because there's a lot of infrastructure costs associated with it as well. I'm confident as an agricultural engineer, we could engineer these systems, but are they cost effective for the farmer?
Sure.
So, I think that, there's still some research needs on that. And certainly as we think about all those other practices, we need to get people interested. We need to be talking to them about the importance and taking advantage of the financial resources that are out there from state and federal programs, but also looking at how we might finance that in the future as well.
Exciting stuff when you think about, recycling drainage water, which is nutrient packed, and using water. You can please a lot of people at the same time if you can achieve, what the farmer needs to achieve from a yield standpoint. So pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Dr. Helmers, we've know a little bit about, but would like to talk a little bit about the Couser modern farm experience. And why don't you just start by telling the listeners, what is the Couser modern farm?
Yeah. Bill Couser is a farmer near Nevada, Iowa. His family has farmed there for a number of years, and he has a son, Tim Couser, that's associated with the farm operation agronomist. And so Bill has been, I think, kind of a leader in looking at, new technology and trying to adopt that. He did that, almost 15 years ago for some beef feedlot runoff. And I think Bill, has looked at, he has some farms, and he wants to kind of show how we can use some of these conservation practices to, enhance maybe crop production, enhance soil health, but also have cleaner water going downstream. And he would make that available to field days of all kinds for people to learn and see what a farmer in Iowa is doing. So I think it's really exciting. And so he's put in some drainage there, kind of 4 big blocks of drainage where each of them are individually drained, that he'll be able to look at some of the impacts of infield management practices. He's done some work with controlled drainage, and then he's put a bioreactor on his farm, and then he's ultimately going to put a saturated buffer or 2 on that farm, all within about a half-mile radius of each other. So people can come out there, they can see all of those practices in one location and how they've worked in the landscape. And then one of the things that we're doing from Iowa State University, and Prinsco is so graciously going to help us with a graduate student to do some of the work, is to monitor some of that drainage water, to document what's coming out of those drain blocks, what's coming in and out of the bioreactor, and when we get a saturated buffer out there, do that as well. So I think we, not only demonstrating the practices, but evaluating their performance as well. And we're adding that into other data that we're collecting on the performance of bioreactors. So we have a number of other sites kind of right around the Ames area that we'll be able to add that data to kind of get a larger database on the performance of that practice. And we would be doing the same with the saturated buffer. Tom Eisenhart monitors a number of saturated buffers, so any monitoring we do at the Couser farm would be added in and compared to some of those other sites as well.
Yeah, that's exciting. And Prinsco is a leader in the industry, and we want to continue to see our industry progress into areas in which we believe this can go, and we can improve water quality and grow higher yields at the same time. And so it's super exciting for us to be part of that with you guys and find out what's coming and what's possible with yield increases and water quality improvements. One thing you mentioned in there was, people can go and see this. How are they doing that?
Yeah, they have hosted a couple field days already out there. Most of them have been open to the public, and we at Iowa State have been involved with that. They have a website. You can see kind of what their plans are, and I think ultimately they'll probably be showing, some of the data that's collected there too. So if we have, listeners from around the country, I think they can learn more about that from the comfort of their own home, especially as we get into colder weather when we won't be having field days and most of our things are virtual right now anyway.
Do you know from a long-term perspective, how long do they plan on this research project continuing?
That I don't know for sure. I think the hope is it can be long-term.
Sure.
The more that we can see the performance of these practices over a longer period of time, bioreactor is a good example. When do we start to see the performance start to be reduced that we need to replace the wood chips that are in there? And so I think there's real importance in trying to have some level of long-term monitoring. Maybe it's not quite as intensive, as we get on 5 to 10 years, but I think some level of continued evaluation and monitoring is important.
Let's switch subjects a little bit, and a lot of these are attached to one another. But let's talk about climate change. Just the word climate change in our industry and for some of our customers are like, well, I don't know if I believe in climate change. I don't know what's going on. But I think between you and I, we probably would agree that our precipitation patterns are significantly increasing over the last few decades. Let's just talk about that. And one of the things that I kind of wanted to share and then get some feedback from you on is, for generations, the U.S. government has subsidized drainage improvements throughout the Midwest. A lot of that's been for, many, many reasons. A few of them, food security, disease prevention, erosion control, even way back as far as for settlement. But these activities were key in what we were doing from development and sustainability. And now where we've come is we are in one of the most fertile areas and most productive agricultural areas in the whole world. How important, I guess is the right word, is our ability to enhance and adopt our current drainage infrastructure to handle these changing weather patterns?
Yeah, I think it's really important. This part of the world that we're fortunate to live and work in has some of the best soils in the world. And we generally get a reasonable amount of rainfall every year to produce crops. And so, this is an area that I think we should, be looking at ways to optimize production while minimizing the environmental impacts. And I think for us to optimize production in a lot of these areas that are already in annual row crop, our drainage infrastructure is very critical to that. And I think we have to be looking at that infrastructure in the context of, some of the projections for, changing climate. If the projections are wetter springs and drier summers, that may make drainage even more important because all of a sudden a compressed window in the spring to get those timely field operations done are compressed even more. And so, that drainage that we talked about some of those benefits of drainage becomes even more important. So I think as we do look at these landscapes, drainage is going to become more important, not less important. And then I think as we think about redesigning those systems, we have the opportunity to think about how do we redesign those so that we integrate some of these other water quality practices that we talked about. And the time to do that, in my opinion, is at the time of design of a new system. It's a lot easier to integrate that in from the forefront rather than try to retrofit in, at the back end. So, sometimes we can retrofit for sure, but, I think we want to try to be proactive and think about that, right up front.
Yeah, for sure. And, going back to your story at the beginning of the podcast of the picture of you and I think it was 3 generations of Helmers and the stuck tractors, what is, because of climate change and more precipitation, do you believe it's more important or less important than it was 30 years ago to have a effective water management plan?
I think it's more effective, and I really like the way we term this water management plan, because it's about managing that water, and that managing that water can take on many different things. One is kind of a free conventional drainage system, but we can also think about controlled drainage. We can also potentially think about drainage water recycling. So I think that drainage management, water management, on our agricultural lands is just going to become even more critical into the future.
So let's talk about, we talked just briefly earlier about denitrifying wetlands as being one of the practices that you guys are working on, and it's something that I'm excited about. I'm a duck hunter, so I like wetlands, and if we can, and a lot of people in Minnesota like wetlands, and so if we can again have a win-win with our farming communities and our hunters and people that bird watch and enjoy wetlands, it's something that would be really important to continue that practice. But tell us about what Iowa State, how you guys have been involved. I think you guys have led this initiative, and not surprising, is you guys are always on the forefront of these kind of things. But why don't you just start by telling us what is a denitrified wetland and how does it work?
Yeah, I'm glad we have some time to talk about that, and I really want to give credit where credit is due. And Dr. Bill Crumpton here at Iowa State University is really one of the world leaders in the utilization of wetlands on the agricultural landscape. And so, it's kind of a long history. And you mentioned Stu Melvin before, and I always feel like I've had quite big shoes to fill in kind of replacing Stu when I did. But Stu and Jim Baker, another faculty member in our Ag and Biosystems Engineering department, probably 30 years ago, 25 years ago, more like 25, realized, some of the challenges with greatly reducing nitrate from our agricultural systems, through drainage with just infield nitrogen management, and said we need to be thinking about how we treat that water when it comes out of the drain. So they started working with this wetland ecologist, Bill Crumpton at Iowa State University, and started to really do work kind of at the plot scale and then up to full field or small watershed scale. So it's really kind of evolved over that period. And when I started at Iowa State 17 years ago was kind of when the Iowa Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program was started. So this was led by the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship. Dean Lemke was there at IDALS at that time, and a real instrumental partnership of IDALS and the USDA FSA, and it was to target the implementation of these wetlands, where we would surface drainage water into a wetland that might be restored or constructed. That water would travel through that wetland, and the microbes would essentially denitrify, that water as it moves through. And so we'd use the carbon in that kind of small soil layer along the bottom of that wetland to promote that denitrification cycle and get cleaner water going downstream. And I think it's a really, like you said, it's kind of a win-win. Yes, it takes some land out of production, or takes some land to do it, but we have that waterfowl habitat with the wetland and wildlife habitat with the buffer around there. And so I think it's providing kind of a lot of different benefits.
And are you typically engineering these wetlands and building them, or are they existing wetlands? How is that working?
So most of them there's some construction that goes along with them. And so we'll talk about maybe some new systems that Dr. Crumpton's looking at that would take less construction. But really what they've kind of been looking at to date with what they kind of call these breakpoint wetlands, where they'll look for a landscape position that looks like it'll work, where the water surface and the subsurface flow can be captured, and then they may put some type of berm, earthen berm across, or almost a small dam to impound that water. Now, about 75% of the wetland is 3 foot deep, at full water pool or less. So these are shallow. They're, not that deep. So most of them have some level of construction, but historically, pre-settlement, most of these would probably have been hydric soils. So they may have been wetlands or swales before, but with, some of our surface drainage that's happened, over the last 100 and some years, that, they weren't servicing as a wetland right now, but we're somewhat reconstructing or constructing those there.
So what kind of nitrogen decrease are you seeing? I'm sure you guys are monitoring this and going in and coming out of the wetland. And what kind of results are you seeing from these studies?
Yeah, that's what's really exciting. Is that Dr. Crumpton does do a lot of monitoring of this. In fact, he had a paper published earlier this year in the Journal of Environmental Quality that, if anybody listening would like that, just send me an email and we can get Dr. Crumpton to get you a copy. So what he's looked at is he had about 68 site years of data as part of that, wetland site years. And so he monitors on the order of 10 to 20 of these wetlands in any given year. And what he's found is that on average, if you look at, the wet years and the dry years, what he's found is if that wetland pool, the kind of the footprint of the wetland where there would be, ponded water, if that's about 1% of the contributing area, we might expect on the long term reduce downstream nitrate delivery by about 50%. So we're taking 1% of the land area, and then we'll just say there's another couple percent for a buffer around there. So maybe we're taking 3 or 4% of the land area in a strategic location, and by getting that water from the drainage system into that, removing about 50% of the nitrate before it's delivered downstream. Now, I think that's pretty exciting, and just like you said, that wetland not only providing water quality benefit, but providing habitat for wildlife out there as well, for things like, the buffer area, maybe monarch habitat, native bee habitat, those types of things.
Yeah, super.
As well. I think it's one of those things that we can think of from the citizens of our state. That's something that they can tangibly see out there, that, okay, here's a practice that's improving my water quality, but providing a lot of other benefits as well.
For sure. Yeah, super exciting. What kind of, what are you seeing from interest in this? Is there people that are adopting these processes or not yet?
Yeah, so there are. Now, to date, that the Iowa CREP, or Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, has primarily been administered in a way that the IDOLs would identify potential sites, go out and meet with the landowners. So it was a very targeted type of response. And they were a little limited in the financial resources they had. They could only do a handful a year, maybe not even a handful of these types of wetlands a year. With a few additional resources, getting more resources to do this, more and more of those are starting to happen, so that I think we'll start to see that scale up a little bit. But it does get back to the point we talked about before. Not every landowner or every small watershed is going to have a site that's conducive to put one of these wetlands in. That's one reason why they're also looking at situations where maybe we reroute or take off part of the tile main and route it to a depression. We might have a depression up in the landscape that we could route a tile drain into. And in those cases, there might not be as much engineering involved. Take that depression and turn it back into a wetland. And then, when water spills over, it could go back into the tile system. So there's a kind of an emerging practice of what Bill Crumpton would call kind of a tile zone wetland, because those wetlands are kind of situated more up in the tile zone. There's even been some talk of could we pump that drainage into those wetlands. Now down in Iowa, we don't do a lot of pump drainage systems, so that's a little foreign to us. But we've talked to Ellingson up in the valley, and pump drainage is very common there. And so there may be the potential to put these types of wetlands where we don't have to do as much construction. We can pump that water into a depressional feature, have that function as a wetland, and get the water quality benefits that we desire.
Sure. So are you able to partner, or maybe that isn't the right word, but work with environmentalist groups, anybody like that that's interested and excited about the kind of results you're seeing and are willing to embrace the idea and the technology? Yeah,
certainly. IDOLS has been handling most of this, but I know they've partnered with specifically Ducks Unlimited. I think they've had some partnerships with the Nature Conservancy as well. And I forgot one other practice that's kind of important, and where environmental organizations have been really at the forefront of moving this forward is MultiPurpose Oxbow Restoration. And so, as you and probably some of our listeners know, in some of these areas we have some endangered species like the Topeka shiner, and so oxbows can be a habitat, where we've had, our streams meander and cut off these areas that we can maybe see from aerial photos as oxbows. Those areas, there's some programs to restore them to provide habitat for some of those endangered species. But what the Nature Conservancy, the Iowa Soybean Association, the University of Iowa has looked at is, can we think of those as multi-purpose? Can we route drainage water to those oxbows as we restore them, and not only get habitat benefit, but also water quality benefit? Now, again, it's very site specific, because you need to have the potential to restore an oxbow and have an old oxbow site. But they've found those to also be very effective, if we get that drainage water in there, to very effective for nitrate reduction. And I think that's a great example of numerous groups coming together to look at the potential of this practice.
Well, I'm guessing that a lot of our listeners, including me, that they heard it first here. MultiPurpose Oxbow Restoration.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
MultiPurpose Oxbows, and I'm just glad, Jamie, that I didn't get done and realized that I should have mentioned that, because actually MultiPurpose Oxbows was the most recent addition to the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy practice list. So I'm really glad I remembered to mention it.
No, it's interesting, and I'm glad you did, because that's what we're here to provide information on this podcast. So, I don't know if you have a gut feel or you can answer this question at all, but you mentioned, the possibility, something you hadn't thought of and knew is, pumping water like in the Red River Valley. And it actually was one of the questions I had is, it seems like there's a huge opportunity for denitrifying wetlands. That's why I wanted to ask it, maybe a little bit of selfish, because I see the opportunity, but especially in the, the upper northern plains. And how long do you think it'll take to gain interest in other states than Iowa and up into, like that Red River Valley region?
Yeah, I think that we will, I think the next 10 years will move a lot quicker than the last 10 years, because, it's just within the last 5 to 7 years that there's been more of an emphasis on state-level nutrient reduction strategies, in Minnesota, in Iowa, in Illinois, in Indiana. So I think there's there's a real increasing focus on water quality efforts and looking at practices that can, maintain profitability but provide water quality benefit. And so many of these practices that we talked about today, have that potential. So I really think that the next 10 years are going to be really exciting for the industry to think about how we marry these drainage, the water management practices with, kind of with our agricultural production and these water quality practices we talked about. I'm excited as I think about it from a student standpoint. We've seen, I think, an increasing number of our land and water resources engineering students going and working for smaller engineering companies throughout Iowa and the Midwest, where they're working on these types of projects that we're talking about. That these students are going out to design these types of wetland systems, design saturated buffers and bioreactors. And so I think it's, we're getting more resources to put them in. We need to be doing things like this to talk about them, to get people interested in it. And I think once there's a little more interest, and then people can see it in their neighborhood. And so, we still think things like field days are so important so that individuals can come out and see that practice in place and, kind of, you might not be kicking the tires, but, kind of thinking about it that way, coming out and looking at it, seeing what it's like, talking to the landowner about, how big a hassle was this or what were, some of the benefits. So I think we will see a lot more interest. And I'm not usually accused of being an optimist. So I feel pretty strongly that we'll see a lot of increased interest in the next 10 years.
Oh, awesome. Because like I said, I see it as such a big opportunity and an exciting thing that our industry can really put our stamp down and saying, hey, here's how we're helping. When you're saying 50% reduction in nitrates and all we got to do is build a wetland. Yeah, you take a little land out of production, but it's very little and you provide so much more to the landscape. So exciting stuff. One of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast series was that we as an industry don't tell our story well enough of how we manage water on the farm. And I think we've been doing that today, so this could be a little bit of repeating, but, how would you say we can best connect our message to our city cousins?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And, this has been the last 9 months have just been such a challenging time for so many of us. But it's allowed, with some of our extension programs, we haven't been able to do things in person, but we've been able to do a lot more with things like video, and how do we create, my one colleague would say marketing campaign, maybe it is that, to really show these practices to people that might not otherwise see them, and think about how we, can get people out to some of these, how do we have field days or events where we invite the general public to come out and see one of these new wetlands we've built and see what's being done. Because I think we can talk about it, but, they always say a picture's worth 1,000 words, but, and it's kind of seen as believing. If you can see this, experience it, you can see what people are doing. I think about that with some of these wetlands. When you're able to go out and sit there and see the wildlife, see the waterfowl coming in, it really makes you appreciate, what's been developed on that land. There are ways we can do it better. There are ways we need to do it better to enhance the value of it. But, I really think getting people there to experience it is important. And, in some of these cases, we might have to take it to them as we think about things like video and so forth.
For sure. And yeah, my hope and desire is that even through this podcast that people will, they might listen to this and then they might say, well, who is this Dr. Helmers guy? And they do a little more research and then they find the Couser farm and they through that and it just provides them just a better understanding and knowledge of what we're doing, because I don't believe that people have the wrong intentions. I just think that they have misconceptions of what we do, and it isn't necessarily easy to explain subsurface drainage and water management to somebody that very seldom spends any time on the farm. So that's my hope, that's my desire. With that, a few more questions, kind of around telling our story. How helpful is social media, do you think, to telling our story?
I think it is important. I guess I'm kind of kicking and screaming, got into social media. I don't use it a lot, but I do use it a little bit. And I think that's still a way that people get information. One of the things I've wondered about social media is, how often do we cross over from the people we would normally interact with to, those that we might want to try to figure out a positive interaction with. And so, that might be one of those things that social media expert might have a little better view of that. But certainly, I'll just say, I think it's helped me make some connections with some folks in the drainage industry and outside the drainage industry. And to me, it's also a easy way to get some information out there, get some nice pictures out there, that kind of thing. So I think it is important.
Talking about social media, I recently saw another tweet from you. So you do it a little bit more than you think. But I think it was something you shared about sorghum potentially becoming the third crop of Iowa. And I guess my question there is diversifying crop rotation a key ingredient to improving water quality?
I think it can be. And this is where I think any of those diverse things that we think about also need aerated soils. And so, I think that having something living on the ground a greater percentage of the year has great potential to reduce some of the nitrate leaching. And I think it goes hand in hand with the system, and part of that system is water management as well. So, I think now we have to have something that's profitable, right? I mean, we can talk about we want a third crop, but we have to have something that's profitable for farmers. I think farmers will grow something different if it's profitable. I mean, we've sometimes I still remember a comment I got. Somebody said, "We've grown corn and soybeans in Iowa forever. We're always going to grow corn and soybeans." And I thought, well, if we look at the last 100 years, yes, we've grown, over 10 million acres of corn every year. But if you look at 80 years ago, we didn't grow hardly any soybeans. And so, that was a, crop diversification or, cropping system change. And so I think there's potential there, but as I said, any of those are likely going to need aerated soils, which are, where drainage is so important.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. Moving on, we're getting close to finishing up here, but just want to talk a little bit about the future of drainage. And, our industry, the drainage industry, has been through, multiple transformation periods over time. I was thinking about that this morning, and, power trencher, laser guided equipment, from clay pipe to plastic pipe was a huge transition. And, LiDAR and GPS controls are just a few of those periods. I'm wondering what you think of. Are we entering a potential transformation period again when we're talking about water quality and all of the opportunities?
It is. As we think about designing these new systems, I think it's important that we design them in such a way that we could implement some of these practices that we talked about. And maybe it's not implementing them right off the bat because for whatever reason, that's not possible. But thinking about this as, a generation, investment in the drainage, and what might we need to do with that in the future, whether that's laying it out a little differently to accommodate controlled drainage, or laying it out in such a way that you might be able to put a bioreactor in a certain position. So I do think that, it is kind of it may be a very much of a transformational time. And I think that, as I've talked to some contractors out there, I think there are some of them that are like, we need to be on the forefront of these edge of field practices. We need to know how to design them, how to put them in, how to work with those systems. I think there's the potential that those types of individuals will be on the leading edge of a transformational time. And I think that it would be fun to be a part of that, because I think there's lots of benefits to drainage, and the more we can get some of these other features integrated into the designs, the better off we are.
So each state in the Midwest has a goal of being at 45% reduction in nitrates. This is set by the EPA, as you know. And how are we doing with that? And are we going to get there? And what are the keys to getting there?
That's a great question. I think it's 45% by 2035 was the goal. And we are lagging behind that. Can we get to 45? Yes, I think we can. How long will it take? That is a question I don't have an answer for. I think we need to be looking at ways to accelerate the rate of implementation of these practices, and I think a lot of our state agencies are working to do that, and figuring out how do we scale this up. One of the things that I think is important is that we can talk about, let's put all of these practices in, but we also have to have people to do it, right? To design them, to construct them, to maintain them. And so even if we wanted to put in thousands and thousands of bioreactors this next year, I'm not sure we'd have the capacity to do that. So we have to build that capacity over time. So I think that we can get there. I think we need to be looking at ways to really accelerate that level of adoption. And how do we do that? I think there's a few ways. One is, you from the drainage industry talking about the importance of this, because, I can talk about it from the university, and I think some people, maybe a few people would listen to me and say, okay, well, they seem to think this is important. But I think it's important for the agricultural community to say, we want to be a part of this, and we want to help farmers do this, and we want to see things moving forward, as rapidly as we can. And I think that's important, so that people hear the message that we've done some good things, but we have a long way to go, and we need to be very proactive in trying to do that. So I guess that's some of my thoughts on a pretty challenging topic. Again, if I had good answers to that, I'd probably be doing something else.
Well, and it isn't just there is no smoking gun here. It's going to have to be what we've talked about, multiple practices that we're going to have to choose which one works the best for that piece of property, and that's how we're going to get there. So, we on the ground here just really appreciate what you guys are doing to continue to advance and to continue to look at different opportunities. 5 years ago, we wouldn't have had some of the opportunities we do today. So, by 2025, there's going to be things we don't know yet that we are starting to research or starting to implement to get us to that ultimate goal in 2035. So exciting, and we're grateful and thankful that you guys are there to be doing this research for our industry. That's kind of leads us to the end of this thing today. We really appreciate Dr. Helmers, you joining us on the Water Table podcast. It's really been a lot of fun. I think it's been very informative. As we go, what we like to do here is give you one final chance to do what we call our Water Table takeaways, and it's an opportunity for you kind of to give your final thoughts. What would you like to leave with our listeners today?
I would say artificial subsurface drainage, has made Midwestern agriculture what it is in many ways. I think it's important for our future, and I think we can look at ways where we can enhance environmental performance while still having that important subsurface drainage in our field. And hopefully we talked about some of those practices we might be able to use to reduce downstream nutrient loss, but allow us to continue to have the important agricultural production that we have in our fields.
Thanks so much, Dr. Helmers, for joining us. Really appreciate the time and the opportunity to hear what you have to say. I hope it was informative to our guests. And if they want to learn more, how do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, you can get a hold of me anytime at Iowa State University. I'll just say my email is mhelmers@iastate.edu. Or if you just use whatever search engine you like on the internet and search Matt Helmers at Iowa State University, you'll find my contact information. Also, ISU Ag Water Management on Twitter if people want to do that. But I just want to thank you too, Jamie, for this fun conversation and for what you're doing to get word out about water management on our agricultural landscapes.
Thanks so much, and hopefully we'll see each other soon.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for inviting me. Okay, take care.
If you enjoy what you're listening to, you can find us on your favorite podcast platform. You can find us on Twitter or Facebook, and you can also find us at watertablepodcast.com. Thanks for listening.